On the afternoon of September 3, 1878, Charles Stannard watched his daughter Mary walk out the door carrying a tin pail. She was 22 years old, heading just a few hundred yards from their Rockland, Connecticut home to pick berries. At 6 o'clock that evening, he found her body lying on the path. Her throat had been cut. Her hands were folded across her stomach, arranged as if someone had taken time after the violence to compose the scene. This detail mattered. A murderer who panics runs. A murderer who arranges the victim's hands afterward is someone comfortable at the crime scene. Someone who knew this path. Someone who knew Mary well enough to kill her in broad daylight, close to home, and still walk away unseen. By Thursday morning, whispers had hardened into accusations. The entire town knew who that someone was. Mary Stannard existed in a precarious moral space. 2 years earlier, she'd given birth to a son. No husband, no wedding. The father was a married man from another town who'd used her and disappeared. In 1870s New England, this should have marked her as irredeemable. Fallen women were cast out. They became cautionary tales, whispered to daughters as warnings. But Rockland was different with Mary. They saw her as simple, easy-minded, not wicked, but vulnerable, not a temptress, but a victim. Her neighbors understood she hadn't sinned so much as been sinned against. They helped her. They pitied her. They kept her within the community's protective circle, proof of their own Christian charity in an unforgiving age. This mattered enormously. Because when Mary died, the town didn't just lose a girl. They lost their moral high ground. Her murder forced them to confront an unbearable question. What if the evil didn't come from outside? What if it came from within? From the very man who'd taught them to be merciful. The town wanted to believe in monsters from dark woods. Mary's body on that path suggested something far more disturbing. The monster might wear a clerical collar. Herbert H. Hayden was 38, newly appointed to Rockland's Methodist Church. In the winter of 1877, while preaching and teaching school 10 miles away in Madison, he'd hired Mary Stannard to work in his household, to help with chores and keep his wife company during his frequent absences. A Methodist minister in small-town Connecticut wasn't merely a clergyman. He was the community's moral center of gravity. He stood in the pulpit each Sunday and defined righteousness for everyone listening. He visited the sick, counseled the troubled, baptized the babies, buried the dead. His authority rested not on institutional power, but on presumed virtue. He was supposed to be better than other men. If Hayden fell, he wouldn't fall alone. The entire edifice of the church would crack. Every sermon he'd preached would be reframed as hypocrisy. Every soul he'd counseled would question whether their spiritual guidance had come from a murderer. The town's faith in moral authority itself would shatter. And now people were remembering things. Small moments that hadn't seemed significant before suddenly took on weight. Hayden and Mary together in lots and other unfrequented places, evenings. At a church oyster supper in March 1878, Hayden had excused himself to check on the children Mary was watching back at his house. He'd been gone for an hour. At the time, no one questioned it. Now, in retrospect, everyone did. In August 1878, 1 month before her death, Mary arrived at her friend Jane Studley's house in Guilford. She was despondent, visibly distressed. When Mrs. Studley pressed her, Mary broke down. She'd been criminally intimate with Reverend Hayden since that March night, the night of the oyster supper when he'd come home to check on the children. The phrase criminally intimate wasn't euphemism or Victorian prudishness. It was precise legal language. Mary understood exactly what had happened to her and what it meant in the eyes of both God and the law. She believed she was 5 months pregnant. This wasn't a love affair between equals. This was a minister exploiting a young woman already marked by one illegitimate pregnancy, already dependent on his family for employment, already vulnerable in every way society could make a woman vulnerable. Mary had no leverage. Hayden had everything: reputation, authority, the presumption of godliness, a wife, 3 children, a community that would instinctively believe him over her. The power imbalance was absolute, and Hayden knew it. Mrs. Studley told Mary she needed to confront him, demand assistance. Mary took the advice. She wrote to her half-sister Susan Hawley, explaining her situation, and included a letter to be delivered to Reverend Hayden. In it, she requested he take her to New Haven for an abortion, then leave her at the Studleys to recover. But when Mr. Studley learned of this plan, he wanted no part of sheltering a woman who'd undergone an abortion. The scandal could destroy his own family. Mary was sent away. She went to Susan Hawley's house and intercepted her own letter to Hayden before it could be delivered. She destroyed it. She'd decided to confront him face to face instead, to force him to look her in the eye and take responsibility. According to Susan Hawley, Hayden told Mary he'd already acted. He'd seen a doctor in Middletown and obtained quick medicine, an abortifacient, to end the pregnancy. They arranged to meet on September 3rd so he could give it to her. Mary walked to that meeting carrying a tin pail, telling her father she was going to pick berries. She never came home. On September 9th, 6 days after the murder, a hearing began to determine whether sufficient evidence existed to try Reverend Herbert H. Hayden for murder. It lasted 17 increasingly bitter days. The prosecution attempted to introduce testimony from Jane Studley and Susan Hawley, the women who'd heard Mary's confession about the affair and pregnancy. This was explosive evidence. It established motive. It placed Hayden in a desperate situation where exposure would destroy everything he'd built. The defense objected immediately. Hearsay. The women hadn't witnessed anything themselves. They were merely repeating what Mary had told them. And Mary was dead. She couldn't be cross-examined, couldn't be challenged, couldn't defend her own words from scrutiny. The judge agreed. The testimony was excluded. Without the confession, the prosecution's case rested on circumstantial evidence and community suspicion. They had Hayden's knife, which their expert witness claimed bore traces of human blood. But when the judge insisted the defense be allowed to examine the evidence, prosecutors balked. They refused to submit the knife, all but openly accusing opposing counsel of planning to tamper with it. The courtroom erupted. The argument became so heated, so personal, that it overshadowed the evidence itself. Each side accused the other of bad faith. The hearing devolved into professional combat between attorneys, while Mary's death receded into the background. When the dust settled, the prosecution didn't have enough to indict. The hearing collapsed. Public sentiment briefly swung in Hayden's favor. Perhaps this respectable man of God was being destroyed by rumor and overzealous persecution. Perhaps the real crime was what the prosecution was doing to him. Then the doctors finished their work. The first post-mortem had been performed at 3 a.m. on September 4th, mere hours after Mary's body was discovered. It found a star-shaped wound to her head. A blow struck before her throat was cut. But as the case dragged on and new questions emerged, there had been at least 4 separate post-mortems. Every vital organ had been removed, studied, preserved in glass jars. Mary's body had been systematically disassembled in search of truth. 2 new facts emerged from this grim work. Mary Stannard was not pregnant, and her stomach contained enough arsenic to kill 20 people. On September 3rd, the day of the murder, Reverend Herbert Hayden had purchased 1 ounce of arsenic from a shop in Middletown. When questioned, he said it was for killing rats. This changed everything. A cut throat could be explained as rage, as passion spiraling into violence. Even the blow to the head could be framed as a moment of lost control. But poison was different. Poison required planning. Poison meant someone had decided, calmly and deliberately, days in advance, that Mary Stannard needed to die. Arsenic was the signature poison of the Victorian era. Colorless, tasteless, easily disguised in food or medicine. It was called inheritance powder because of how often it appeared in cases where someone stood to gain from a death. In 1878, it was also readily available. You could buy it at any pharmacy by claiming you had a rat problem, and Hayden had bought it on the day he'd arranged to meet Mary and give her medicine. The grand jury reconvened. This time, they indicted Reverend Herbert H. Hayden for the murder of Mary E. Stannard. The trial began October 7, 1879, more than a year after Mary's death. It would last over 3 months and cost the town more than $30,000, equivalent to roughly $900,000 today. More than 100 witnesses were called to testify, including 15 doctors and at least 4 Methodist clergymen. But the trial's real drama came from the parade of expert witnesses. 12 distinguished professors from Yale University, 3 more from the University of Pennsylvania, all summoned to testify about the chemical and medical properties of arsenic, about microscopic analysis of crystals, about how poison moved through the human body and what traces it left behind. This was America entering the age of forensic science, the moment when microscopes and chemical analysis promised to reveal truth more reliably than eyewitnesses ever could. The courtroom became a stage for a new kind of authority, not moral or religious, but scientific, objective, supposedly unchallengeable. Except the experts couldn't agree on anything. Professor Edward S. Dana never used a word of 1 syllable when 1 of 5 would answer the purpose, the newspapers reported, with barely concealed contempt. He testified about microscopic measurements of arsenical octahedrons, about crystalline structures visible only through advanced magnification. When pressed by the defense attorney, he stated flatly that these were matters no ordinary mortal could understand. The implication was clear. Trust me, because you're too ignorant to comprehend what I'm telling you. Professor Moses C. White took the opposite approach. He refused to commit to anything with certainty. When asked if he had seen a certain object, he replied that, "My eyes saw it," but he wouldn't state with absolute certainty that he himself had seen it. The distinction seemed absurd to everyone watching, but White insisted on philosophical precision. How could he know his perceptions were reliable? How could anyone truly claim certainty about anything? The press watched this parade of academic arrogance and evasion with growing disgust. The public, hoping science would deliver clarity, got only competing certainties and philosophical games. 12 Yale professors and 3 from Pennsylvania couldn't agree on whether the arsenic in Hayden's barn matched the arsenic found in Mary's stomach. Actually, they could agree on that. The experts proved through microscopic analysis that the arsenic found in Hayden's barn was not from the same batch as what he'd purchased in Middletown on September 3rd, which meant the arsenic he'd bought, the arsenic he'd purchased on the day of the murder, had gone somewhere else, presumably into Mary Stannard's stomach. But even this damning fact became muddied in expert testimony. Could arsenic from different batches really be distinguished? How reliable were these microscopic measurements? What margin of error existed? The more the experts explained, the less certain anything became. Science had promised answers. It delivered only more questions. The defense floated other possibilities. Perhaps Mary's father, Charles Stannard, had killed her, tired of supporting an unwed mother and her illegitimate child. Perhaps Ben Stevens, the 60-year-old man boarding at the Stannard house, had done it. Perhaps one of the local indigents, someone with a grudge or a moment of madness. At one point, Judge Lounsbury took the extraordinary step of subpoenaing every adult male citizen of Rockland to testify to their whereabouts on September 3rd, hoping to systematically eliminate suspects until only the guilty remained. It brought him no closer to the truth. Each alternative suspect had an alibi. Each had insufficient motive. The defense wasn't seriously proposing any of these men as the real killer. They were simply muddying the waters, creating reasonable doubt by suggesting the murder could have been anyone. In a case built entirely on circumstantial evidence, anyone was all the defense needed. Truth fractured into versions. Each version had its own internal logic, its own narrative coherence, and none could be definitively proven or disproven. But the trial's turning point came when Reverend Herbert H. Hayden and his wife Rosa took the stand. They were calm, composed. They spoke clearly, without hesitation or visible distress. Hayden denied any improper relationship with Mary Stannard. He denied being the father of her non-existent pregnancy. He explained the arsenic purchase straightforwardly. Rats in the barn. A common problem, nothing sinister. His wife corroborated everything. They presented as a united front, a respectable couple whose lives were being destroyed by false accusations and malicious gossip. This mattered more than any scientific testimony. Victorian juries trusted demeanor. They believed that guilt showed itself in nervous gestures, in stammering speech, in the inability to meet one's accuser's eyes. Hayden and his wife looked directly at their questioners. They never wavered. They performed innocence flawlessly. The prosecution tried to break them. They hammered at inconsistencies, pressed for admissions, attempted to provoke the crack in the facade that would reveal truth beneath. But the Haydens didn't crack. They remained poised, reasonable, almost serene, as if their very calmness proved they had nothing to hide. The jury watched, and the jury doubted. Psychology was beginning to outweigh expertise. Manner was trumping microscopy. The question wasn't what the arsenic crystals revealed under magnification. The question was, did this man, this minister, this husband and father, seem like someone capable of murder? To 11 of the 12 jurors, he did not. The case went to the jury on January 16, 1880. They deliberated for 82 hours, 3 days and nights of argument behind closed doors. 100 witnesses had testified. 15 doctors had given medical opinions. 15 professors had explained the science of poison. The prosecution had presented hundreds of pages of evidence. The defense had systematically dismantled every claim. And still, the jury couldn't decide. Later, it emerged that 11 jurors believed Hayden was innocent, or at least that reasonable doubt existed. One juror was convinced of his guilt and refused to be swayed. He'd watched the same trial as everyone else. He'd heard the same expert testimony, seen the same performance of innocence. But he believed, absolutely, that Herbert and Rosa Hayden were lying. He couldn't prove it. He just knew. For 82 hours, 11 men tried to convince him he was wrong. He wouldn't yield. Finally, exhausted, they informed Judge Lounsbury they were deadlocked. A hung jury. This was perhaps the most disturbing verdict possible. Not guilty, which would have meant the system worked, justice prevailed, an innocent man was exonerated. Not even guilty, which would have meant closure, accountability, someone punished for Mary's death. Instead, uncertainty. The jury couldn't agree. The system couldn't deliver a verdict. Mary Stannard was dead. Herbert Hayden was neither convicted nor cleared. And the town was left with questions that would never be answered. The state attorney agreed to release Reverend Hayden upon payment of a nominal bond. He returned briefly to the Methodist ministry, but the shadow of the trial made his position untenable. Eventually, he left the clergy and returned to his original trade, carpentry. He was never retried. The state had spent a fortune on the first trial and gotten nowhere. Double jeopardy didn't apply. A hung jury wasn't an acquittal. But prosecutors had no appetite for another 3-month ordeal that would likely end the same way. Hayden lived the rest of his life as a carpenter in Connecticut, neither vindicated nor condemned, forever marked by the trial, but never convicted. Mary Stannard was buried. Her illegitimate son grew up without a mother. Her father lived with the memory of finding her body on that path, and no one was ever held legally accountable for her death. The case became one of those historical mysteries that haunt a place, the kind where everyone in town knows what they believe happened, but no one can prove it. Some believed Hayden was guilty and had escaped justice through clever lawyering and a charismatic performance. Others believed he was innocent, destroyed by circumstantial evidence, and a community eager to believe the worst of a man in authority. The truth died with Mary on that path in September 1878.